So I've called into the David Pakman Show and spoken to David about 4 or 5 times. So this clip I'm about to show you is from the last time I spoke with David around 3 months ago now. I've seen how defensive David gets whenever anybody contradicts him on the Trump-Russia scandal or criticizes how much he talks about it. And when that happens, he does this thing where he filibusters about the 17 indictments, and he talks about Michael Cohen, and he talks about Paul Manafort, or he will ask the guests a bunch of basic questions, and he says he's doing it in order to establish basic facts about the Trump-Russia scandal and to see if they agree on the basic facts. But really, it seems like he just rang out the clock on the phone call by going over something that's been talked about on his show 1,000,001 times instead of addressing whatever the actual concern is that that person had. So to avoid that, I called in and I asked David a very specific question about the mainstream media coverage about the whole Trump-Russia scandal. I can't say I was shocked by David's response because he has firmly placed himself in the camp that this Trump-Russia story is the biggest scandal of the Trump presidency. But I was a little surprised to hear him make such a shitty argument live on air. At first, he tries to completely ignore the question that I asked him and straw man my position. Then he makes a completely delusional statement where he tries to make Russian interference in the 2016 election out to be the most egregious thing to ever happen in recent years. Again, this call was about 3 months ago, and I must say, this did not age well for David Pakman. I only have the audio of this clip, but listen to it because it's very telling, especially seeing how David is trying to make it seem as if he wasn't hyperventilating about this whole Trump-Russia scandal for the last 2.5 years. And one more thing before I play the clip, my name is Dontel, but for some reason, every time I call into the show, he calls me Dante. And I've corrected him multiple times, so I don't know if he's trolling or if he just really doesn't hear me correcting him on my name, whatever it is. But here's a clip. It's about 3 minutes long, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Let's kick off the stream. I know I didn't get to you last time, Dante from Florida. Dante, you know sometimes you call in and filibuster, though, so I'm going to put you on, but I hope that you're ready to go with the topic or question.
David, I'm ready to go. It's a good one.
Cool.
All right, so it's a quick question. Do you think that the mainstream media and corporate Democrats have blown the Trump-Russia story out of proportion for their own political purposes, especially seeing how they don't pay anywhere near as much attention to when Trump and other U.S. presidents have way worse and more nefarious connections to other foreign governments?
What would be an example of Trump's more concerning than Russia connections?
Like Donald Trump's business connections with Saudi Arabia, and then actually assisting them in a genocide in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet right now that's being...
We have been talking... So I disagree with your premise, Dante. I mean, I have been talking about that a lot. However, so I think that there is this talking point that's being spread, which is the real collusion was with Saudi Arabia. No, I mean, it's totally immoral that we continue to sell Saudi Arabia all the weapons that we sell. It's completely immoral that we continue to maintain this relationship given what they're doing in Yemen. I completely am on board with you, but there is no concerted effort that we have seen to hide meetings with Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia was providing opposition research in violation potentially of the emoluments clause. So I've been covering what you're talking about, and I just don't think it's nearly of the same scope as what we've seen with Russia.
Well, I'm not saying that it's you specifically. My question was about the mainstream media because it seems that they have an motive because, like I mentioned, they don't pay anywhere near as much attention when Trump has these other and worse.
So Dante, you're right that the media corporate media has never paid enough attention to our immoral relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I'm completely on board with you with that critique. I just maintain that it's separate from what's going on with Russia.
But also, you said that you think that the Russia... Yeah, I honestly agree that Trump has gone way more out of his way to cover up the Russia story, but I think that's because there's more focus being paid to that. But the Saudi Arabia situation is just, at face value, objectively, it's just way worse because it's a literal genocide, and he's profiting from it, and he is refusing to criticize them, even when they murdered a U.S. journalist. and he's doing it because he's taking money from this government. So I think that's honestly way worse than anything that could possibly come out of what Mueller or any of these other many investigations are.
No, they're just two different things. I mean, one is a systemic issue related to American foreign policy with Saudi Arabia, which is an atrocious embarrassment. The other is specific and concerted, possibly criminal actions for the purposes of winning a particular election. So, okay, point made, Dante. I think we just maybe don't agree on this.
Okay, so you see what I was talking about. My question was very direct. Quote, do you think the mainstream media and corporate Democrats have blown the Trump-Russia story out of proportion for their own political purposes, since they don't do this for other, more nefarious ties to foreign governments? David asked me to name the other ties that Trump has to foreign governments, and I said Saudi Arabia. Then he completely disregards my actual question and strawmans my position in order to answer a question that I did not ask. He says, quote, I disagree with your premise. I've been covering that story a lot. I think there's a talking point being spread that the real collusion is with Saudi Arabia, not with Russia. But that has nothing to do with the question I asked. At no point did I say the real collusion is with Saudi Arabia, not with Russia. At no point in that discussion did I say that. So I have no idea why he would bring up that, quote, talking point if I didn't bring it up at all. Well, I know why he did it. David Pakman is very much a sophist at times. He's a wordsmith who uses these sleight of hands that are very subtle so that he can steer the conversation back to a place where he feels like he has the strongest argument, even though it doesn't really address the question or the criticism that was originally presented to him. It's called straw manning, and when David does it, it's not easy to pick up on unless you're familiar with the show and you've seen him do this before. In this case, the straw man that he's trying to use is this, quote, talking point that the real collusion is with Saudi Arabia, not Russia. Then he moves on to another trick called the bait and switch. He makes some points that he agrees with some of the things that I said, like our relationship with Saudi Arabia is immoral and we should stop selling them weapons. Then he throws in a curveball by saying, but there's no real effort from the Trump administration to hide contacts and meetings with Saudi Arabia. And that there's no evidence that the Saudis were trying to provide opposition research during the election in violation of the emoluments clause. Therefore, Trump's relationship with Saudi Arabia is not of the same magnitude as the alleged Trump-Russia scandal. There's a whole lot to break down there, and that last statement was the most ridiculous thing David said in this entire call. To say that the Trump administration isn't trying to hide meetings and contacts with Saudi Arabia, that's just not true. At that time, which is around mid-January, there had already been multiple reports that Jared Kushner on a regular basis was messaging the Crown Prince on WhatsApp, and those messages were not reported as official government contacts and had not been archived in violation of several records-keeping laws. So David's statement was just incorrect. But even if that wasn't true, how does them meeting in secret make their relationship worse? Right now, we have an agreement and a partnership to do a genocide out in the open. Would it be a bigger scandal if they were doing the genocide in secret and having secret meetings about it? So secret meetings or public meetings is irrelevant because at the end of the day, we are slaughtering thousands and thousands of innocent people, so that was just a stupid point to begin with. So let me get to the next point, which was equally stupid. He is literally making the argument that because Russia hired some people to post some memes on Facebook and on Twitter, as well as releasing the DNC emails, as well as releasing the DNC and Clinton campaign emails, which we should have seen anyway. Because of that, the Trump-Russia scandal is even worse than Donald Trump being personally bribed to continue a genocide. Again, that's just a fucking dumb argument on so many levels. First of all, the memes that were posted on Facebook and Twitter were entirely irrelevant to the election results. Nobody who saw those memes said, you know what? I was going to vote for Hillary Clinton because I agree with her on all these policies. But then I saw a meme on Facebook with her holding a pitchfork and having devil horns on her fucking forehead. Now I'm going to go vote for Donald Trump. Those were the memes that were being posted that everybody's fucking losing their mind about. So anyone who at this late date in 2019 is still hyperventilating about memes posted on Facebook, they have their heads very, very far up their asses and have a problem putting things into perspective. And the DNC emails. First of all, they should have been public anyway. And secondly, what they showed was damning corruption within the DNC and the Clinton campaign and the mainstream media to rig the entire primary against Bernie Sanders and the progressive movement in order to anoint Hillary Clinton, the establishment candidate, as the nominee. There were also other very important things in those emails, like Hillary Clinton admitting that Saudi Arabia is the #1 exporter of jihadism and Salafism, all while she continued to sell weapons to them as Secretary of State. There were also some transcripts of her Wall Street speeches where she was saying that the rich are unfairly scapegoated and persecuted in the United States, and that there's bigotry against the rich. There were also excerpts of speeches where she was saying that she'd be willing to let Wall Street regulate themselves since they are the smartest people in the room. She talked about how she has public positions and private positions, so she admitted that she's just a fucking liar who will say anything that the people want to hear in order to get elected. There were emails that proved the Clinton Foundation was just a front to launder bribes to the Clintons in order to receive favorable policy. There was all of this damning information in those emails, and yet people like David Pakman and people in the mainstream media are still hyperventilating about the fact that Russia may have leaked those emails, while they have just completely stopped talking about the substance of those emails, the corruption that was in those emails. And also, the people who are obsessed about the fact that Russia, quote, interfered with our election, to me, it comes across as if they're suggesting that if it wasn't for the Russian interference, the United States has pristine, free and fair elections. Anyone who knows anything about politics knows that the elections in the United States are some of the most corrupt and illegitimate in the entire Western world. We have billionaires who are legally allowed to buy campaigns and bribe politicians for favorable policies. We have voter suppression and outright election fraud. I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz rigged her election against Tim Conover twice and illegally destroyed the paper ballots, even though a judge said that they needed to be preserved for a recount. You have Brian Kemp overseeing his own election for governor in Georgia, kicking hundreds of thousands of people off the voter rolls who would have likely voted for Stacey Abrams. Then he narrowly ekes out a victory, and now he's the governor. He stole that election. Where's the fucking media coverage and outrage about that? We have the Electoral College that goes against the will of the majority of the people in this country when it comes to presidential elections. We have insane gerrymandering. We also have other foreign governments like Israel and Saudi Arabia who have a stranglehold on US politics through their lobbyists, and those countries have basically every elected politician in the United States willing to bend their knee and give them whatever policy they ask for. So stop acting like memes were such a stain and a scourge on the US's pristine elections, because we don't live in a free and fair democracy. This is an oligarchy. This is a plutocracy. This is a corporatocracy, where on a regular basis, the will of the people is ignored in order to serve powerful moneyed interests. And this should also go without saying, but the US does way worse in other countries' elections, including Russia. We start coups, we assassinate leaders, we actually change votes and rig elections. So please, please, David, spare me. So a reminder of what he was saying. David was suggesting that because Trump associates have tried to hide their contacts with Russians, and because the Russians posted some memes and leaked the undoctored words of Democratic elites in the United States, the Trump-Russia scandal is of a bigger magnitude than a fucking genocide. Because of what the US and Saudi Arabia are doing in Yemen, 85,000 children have starved to death. About 20,000 people have died directly from the bombing that the Saudis are doing in Yemen. We've fucking completely destroyed the infrastructure. 16 million people in the country are on the brink of famine and death. At least 50% of the hospitals are no longer operational because they've been bombed by the Saudis, or they can't get medical supplies in because of the blockade. There's an unprecedented cholera outbreak in the country. The UN and human rights organizations have come to the conclusion that this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world to happen in the last 50 years, and it is entirely man-made. I am floored that David would make such a ridiculous argument. I didn't even get to check him on all of that during the call because I knew I wasn't going to have much time. So instead of entertaining his straw man argument, I decided to ask my question again. which was, what do you think about the mainstream media's coverage about the Trump-Russia scandal, and do you think that they were blowing it out of proportion? And now he dodges the question for a second time by saying, yeah, I think the mainstream media has never paid enough attention to our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that's a problem. He refused to say the mainstream media, who have been pushing this Russiagate bullshit for 2.5 years, coming up with the most outlandish conspiracies day in and day out. Rachel Maddow spent her entire show talking about it for the last 2.5 years. And still, David couldn't bring himself to say, you know what, I may not agree with some of the points that you're making, but I do think that they're blowing this out of proportion, and I do think that they're over-focusing on it and ignoring other important issues. And right now, this is my speculation, but the reason why I think he couldn't say that, because then he would be kind of opening himself up to the same criticism, because he's also devoted an irrational amount of time speculating and pontificating about this whole Trump-Russia collusion nonsense. The only other reason I can think of for David refusing to provide any criticism of the mainstream media over their coverage of Trump-Russia is if he agrees with them, and that's just even more sad. Even Cenk, who's one of the biggest Russiagate peddlers in independent media, at times has criticized the mainstream media's coverage over the issue. Which brings me to my last point. David Pakman is not an idiot. Even though I disagree with him on a lot of things, he's an intelligent person. But when it comes to Trump, Russia, and some other issues, David is just so headstrong and arrogant and convinced that he's right, that he refuses that he could possibly be wrong. And he finds himself in a position where he's basically dug himself into a hole, and it'd be pretty embarrassing for him to turn around now and say, you know what, I think I was wrong about this whole time. So instead, he just doubles down and triples down, and he won't ever give an inch. Which is why he makes ridiculous arguments like Russia posting memes on Facebook is worse than Trump being bribed to continue a genocide with US taxpayer money. He's so invested in this Trump-Russia scandal that he cannot see straight anymore. There is no reasoning with David Pakman on this issue. According to David, his position on this issue is the absolute truth, and anyone who disagrees with him, even anybody on the left, they are either trolls or bots, or they're uninformed or repeating Republican talking points. Any and every excuse you can find to dismiss the people who are making valid criticisms about the Trump-Russia story, he will do it. In my opinion, David Pakman has lost a lot of credibility among people on the left for the way that he's just dove headfirst into this Trump-Russia conspiracy. I'm not just basing this off of this one phone call that I had with him. This is from seeing his years of hyperventilating about this Trump-Russia scandal. Also, one last thing. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I've spoken to David Pakman about 4 or 5 times. And every time it's been a pretty interesting back and forth, which is why he kept picking up my calls. But ever since me and him had this discussion about Russiagate, he's never picked up any of my calls on the show or in his live streams. My guess, like I stated earlier, is David doesn't like to be challenged on Russiagate. I don't really care that much. I wanted to call and ask him about other issues like Venezuela and the Ilhan Omar controversy that he's also gotten dead wrong. Because those are some other areas where David is just completely off the mark, and I wanted to really see what's behind his thought process on those issues. But either way, I think this was a very telling conversation. And if you guys would like to see any more of my calls with David Pakman, just let me know in the comment section.